Welcome to Press On Podcast with Mike Woodruff, where Mike and invited guests share insights to cultivate a biblical perspective and thoughtful resilience in challenging times.
Well, I am excited today to have a chance to talk with an old friend and colleague, Evan Hunter. Evan and I overlapped on a bunch of things. When I came to Christ Church in 1999, Evan, were you still a student then? Were you finishing your MDiv?
I was finishing the MDiv then,
Yeah, so Evan was finishing his MDiv, but he was on staff at Christ Church, focusing on college students. I came in, I was a part-time guy. I was doing some work with ScholarLeaders. At the time, it was called CISF, for Christian International Scholarship Foundation. And Evan was the college pastor here at Christ Church. And so we overlapped with that. And then I pulled him into the Ivy Jungle Network, which we worked on for, I don't know, a half dozen years together, and also CISF. And then, and Becky was sort of on staff at various times. So Evan got his undergraduate degree at Wheaton. He also did part of that time at Baylor, but surprise, surprise, a woman persuaded him to leave Baylor, and he went to Wheaton, graduated from Wheaton. Or did you go the other way around? Did you start?
No, I went back.
You go to Baylor?
I started at Baylor, finished at Wheaton, went to Europe in the middle.
That's right.
Becky played a role all
study
along.
in Germany for a while. And then you did a master's degree at Trinity, and then Becky did a master's degree at Wheaton, and then you did a PhD at Trinity, and then are now on staff with the group used to be called CISF and now is called ScholarLeaders. So let me just take a minute and sort of level set the room on ScholarLeaders, since we'll get back to that in a bit. But 40 years ago, because the idea for Evan and I to have this chat was 2 weekends ago. We were both in Pasadena on Fuller's campus for the Scholar Leader board meeting, which celebrated 40 years of this ministry. So 40 years ago, 3 young guys at the time, Tom Cooper, Steve Hayner, and Mark Laverton, who all had connections with John Stott, agreed to start a ministry like Langham. So John Stott, Uncle John, was using the royalties from the books that he was selling, and he was using all of that to fund the PhD studies for men and women from the majority world, 2/3 world, whatever. At the time, I'm not even sure what it got called. But Africa, Asia, Latin America, and then eventually former Soviet bloc countries. And to invest in their theological education, these were the sort of young but proven leaders who were going to go back. And Langham was particularly focused on sort of the academic stars and scholars. And so they were doing their PhD studies at that point almost exclusively in Europe, I think mostly at Cambridge and Oxford. And so Tom and Mark Laverton, who has just stepped down a couple of weeks ago from being president of Fuller, and Steve Hayner, who has gone to be with the Lord, but Steve would go on to be the president of InterVarsity and then the president of Columbia Theological Seminary in Georgia. All just exceptional guys. And they were in their 30s when they started this group. They were going to do what John was doing, but they were going to raise money from their friends and direct it towards people that were studying primarily at Trinity and Fuller, though they also picked up occasionally students at Regent College in Vancouver. And then over the last 40 years, both of these groups have grown quite significantly. And now, wow. So ScholarLeaders is now training pastors, like 50. There's 50 students that are studying at like 35 institutions. Is that close?
Yeah, it's in those ballparks every year. Some 50 plus scholars doing their PhDs, and any given year it's 35 different institutions.
Yeah.
You know, they obviously ebb and flow, but it's tremendously different than just Trinity and Fuller.
Yes. And when I got involved, and so when Sherry and I got involved in the early 90s, this has been one of the great joys of our lives. When we got involved, it was a much smaller organization. I think we were giving a couple $1,000s a year to like 7 or 8 scholars. And I stayed involved. I eventually became the executive director, and then we changed that title to president. I did that for a dozen years, and the organization grew quite a bit. And then Larry Smith took over. Well, there was a little bit of a hiatus. There was a couple other people in there for a year or two, but then Larry Smith took over and served as president for 12 years. And under Larry, the organization really took off and moved in some other directions. And then now Christopher Hayes is the new president, a relatively young guy, PhD from Oxford. Christopher has been in the job for a year, maybe?
Yep.
Has it been a year?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And Evan, you are the vice president. There's now like 9 or 10 staff all over the world, and you have responsibilities. In particular, I know you've got responsibilities for the journal, but also do we call you the vice president of programs? I'm sorry, I should know this.
Yeah, I think my title right now is integration. As we've developed all these great programs with very capable leaders, I'm the guy kind of touching a lot of them and pulling them together. Yeah.
Okay.
So that we remain unified even as we continue to expand and grow the work.
Well, the whole idea here, and there is a reason why I want to talk about this, but the whole idea was to place the leadership of the church in various countries, throughout Africa, Asia, Latin America, as the world where the church is exploding. The goal was to make sure that the leadership was indigenous to that country, or at least that continent. And so the idea, and I mean, this has gone through a half dozen different iterations. When Stott was doing it initially, the idea was we've got to, God's plan is the church. We've got to have strong churches. The way to have strong churches is to have strong pastors. Who's going to shape the pastors? Who's going to write the books? Who's going to teach the classes? Who's going to lead the denominations? We want to go after those people, those 1 in a million. And that was a McGavran sort of idea that you could train a level 1 leader. And that is somebody that was going to sort of, if there was 100 new Christians in an area, you needed a level 1 leader that was going to do basic follow-up and point people towards the church. For every 1,000 new Christians, you were going to, you needed a level 2 leader. They needed more training, ideally a college degree. For every 100,000 new Christians in an area, you needed a level 3 leader, sort of somebody to pastor the pastors. And they would have ideally at least a master's degree. But then for every 1 million new Christians in an area, you needed a level 4 leader, a thought and opinion leader. And this sort of got equated with a PhD. You could be a level 4 leader without a PhD, and you could have a PhD and not be a level 4 leader. But the idea was we're going after those people. And it was a relatively limited number. When I was involved, I'm still on the board, but when I was president, we were really drilled down just on scholarships, trying to provide scholarships for those people. And I think the last year I was involved, we were probably doing 25 or 30 scholarships and funding them at more like 15,000 or 20,000. And I know it's just gone up from there. But not only has it gone up from there, but it's sort of expanded in other directions. So talk for a minute, Evan, about how during your time, because you've now been on staff for how long?
18 years.
18 years. So what are the changes that you have seen over the 18 years?
Yeah, well, thanks, Mike. And I did end up getting into this because of our friendship. So on the good days, I bless you.
I mean, am I getting credit for this, or is this like, wow?
On the bad days, there's maybe an utterance of a curse.
I've almost been killed numerous times in various countries, and yeah, my name comes up in those bad moments.
So fortunately, the bad moments are far fewer than the good ones. But
okay.
It has been, it's been a joy and a privilege to be a part of this for almost 20 years. And who would have thought that when you rolled into Christ Church and met the young college ministry missions pastor guy, that this is where we'd be.
No gray in that beard back then, as I remember.
That is for sure. And I don't think there's any other colors but gray in it now. So here we are. But and to see it grow. And I mean, when I joined CISF, I was the only full-time employee for a while there, because you were a part-time executive director, president, and now we are this large staff. So that's been exciting to see that growth. And I would say over that time, one thing that's remained constant, and that's the focus on the theological leader, what you just described as that level 4 leader. And right now we're really referring as the theological leader, the people who train the trainers. They're the executive leaders guiding denominations, guiding seminaries. They're the ones who are writing books and shaping theological reflection and thought. They're starting new works. They're entrepreneurial, missional entrepreneurs. There's just a lot going on around that theological leader. But over the course of these last number of years, much of our growth has come not because the mission has changed around them, but because we've been maturing with those leaders. As many of those leaders return to their home countries, we're teaching, often promoted to be presidents of seminaries. At one point, I'd done a study, and in Africa, the average time from finishing a PhD to being president of a seminary was somewhere between 6 and 24 months. So the on-ramps were short.
Wow.
And as you can imagine, doing a PhD in Old Testament is not necessarily the great training, for president of an organization. Oh, and by the way, do it in a nation that's struggling just to survive economically or has civil unrest, has a whole host of challenges facing it, whether it was the AIDS crisis back in the early 2000s, current issues with, ISIS or whoever the terrorist flavor is of the month, or whatever the case may be. You're trying to navigate all of that. And so part of what came was, as we talked with those graduates and listened to their needs, we saw opportunity. How do we help them as senior leaders develop the work that they are doing as theological leaders, leading seminaries in a way that's sustainable and vital and allows their institutions to flourish so that the church can continue to flourish? And so that became this vital sustainability initiative, now led by Dr. Emmanuel Bellin, who had once been president of one of the seminaries in Kenya, had been supported by CISF for his degree at Fuller, and just bringing a whole host of insight and leadership and mentoring to these leaders who find themselves just paddling as hard as they can to stay afloat. And how do we help them, like we said, not only sustain and survive, but actually thrive and do things that are meaningful for the sake of the church? And through that process, we also were listening to what are the pertinent issues? Where are some common things that rise up that might be uniquely met by this group of leaders across the majority world? They're issues that differ considerably from those in the West. And from the beginning, we've always talked about many of these leaders come and write PhDs on topics that are just foreign to issues we face in the West. And your pastoral ministry differs so greatly from the pastor in some of these other places and what they're being asked about, and how does that fit together? And whether it's persecution or, a few years ago, witchcraft across Africa, which is very different than what do we do with Harry Potter, and questions like that are so intense, and how to bring. And so we started to identify a handful of these and champion around them, one of which is the idea of Christianity and Islam. Most Muslims live in the same areas of Africa, Asia, Latin America, Middle East, and even parts of Central Asia, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, where we're working. And it's a different kind of conversation than often it is in the West, when sisters, brothers, cousins may be Muslim and living next door to Christians.
So, yeah, I remember, there's so many stories of either traveling and being with the leaders once they've returned, which has been a great joy. We got a trip coming up, every time we go to Israel, to go to Nazareth and to be with Johanna Catenaccio, or to be in, Jerusalem or Bethlehem with Salim Munayer and others whose education we funded. And then in India with, around the world, Belarus and throughout Africa, Egypt, and other places. And I remember on one trip I was traveling. So I was traveling with one of our scholars, and I won't mention his name just because he was headed to a very closed country, and he was going to work with Islam. He had grown up as a Muslim, and then he had become a leader in sort of a Marxist movement. And he was a relatively young guy when he converted. He was pastoring a church in which he had not been able to get to an Easter service because he was, at the time, it was his conversion was being kept a secret. He couldn't get there. And everybody that had been at that service was then either killed or had been imprisoned. And he's telling me about his life. But what I remember is we're going through an airport in the US, and I'm stopped and scrutinized while I'm traveling with him. And I remember saying, oh, by the way, he had spent time studying economics, Marxist economics in Moscow. And then when he was discovered, he spent time in prison at the time in Ethiopia. That's not where he is now. But I remember we're stopped going through the airport. I'm trying to take him to this next event where he's going to speak, and we're trying to raise money for this. And I wanted to say to the TSA agent, like, look, you are looking at the definition of a terrorist. Like, how in the world are you stopping me when this guy is right next to you? And but I so wanted him to get to the next site, and just hearing his stories about what he was putting up with. And then another, we had a very just ironic, winsome, very soft-spoken guy. He and his family over for Christmas afternoon. They were studying at Trinity and had him over for Christmas, and he was reflecting on, the decision that he had to make when he was dean of the seminary, when a couple years earlier, when there was an insurgency and there was a group of radical Muslims who were going to burn down the school. And the school was not just the school, but it was also the dorms, and it was the homes of all the faculty. And he asks me, he goes, would you how would you respond? And I just thought, how would I respond if I heard? I mean, what he did is he gathered all the men together, and they formed a perimeter around the school, and they said, we're not going to attack, but we will defend this ground. We're not going to let you burn it down. We're not going to let you hurt anybody. And those are not the questions that we talk about in the West when we are getting our master's degree of divinity. So it's just very important to have leaders trained who understand their context and can minister there. So to have a focus on Islam, and I want to say you have a focus on corruption and a focus on poverty and a focus on women. I mean, there have been these areas of particular concentration. Have I named them all, or are there other?
You have, yeah. So certainly the concentration on Islam, as we described, and really trying to champion and promote women in theological leadership. Women face a number of hurdles, some of them cultural, contextual, some of them just part of even the church world at times, and how to continue to encourage them in their journeys and to pursue their callings as God has brought them into leadership and ministry. And then corruption and poverty right now fall under an area we're calling church and society. What is this very public engagement of our faith? I think one of the saddest things is we look around, some of the most Christian nations in the world are among the most corrupt and most broken. And what's going on with the church? Why isn't it working in a way that translates into public action? And then the reality in this last year, the war in Ukraine has brought a whole bunch of similar but different questions related to that public engagement. How does the church engage society in the midst of a war when all action is very public and engaged, and where does the church sit in the middle of that? And even your question of arming the faculty, practical and public theology are very real for many of these folks.
So, and that brings us to the reason. I mean, we started having this conversation in the courtyard of the hotel in Pasadena a couple of weeks ago, because you were in Moldova when the war in Ukraine, when the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened. You were with Ukrainians, as I remember, in Moldova, and you had to sort of to make tracks. All of you had to make tracks to get out of Moldova, some to get back into Ukraine. You had Russians showing up, Russian church leaders showing up. Am I remembering this all right?
Yeah, that's correct. So a year ago, I was in Moldova. We were attending a 2-week series of meetings, working sequentially with seminary leaders from Ukraine, Russia, Moldova, and Kyrgyzstan. So they were each going to come in for 3 days, and we're going to work with each school and make these plans. And the first school was from Krasnodar, Russia. And all the while, all of this buildup on the border and this rhetoric is going on, and tensions are rising, and we're kind of living in the middle of it.
To sort of level set the room, you're in Moldova. Moldova is
a tiny country next to Ukraine, wedged between Ukraine and Romania, and that also is host to a Russian-controlled area that holds one of their battalions of tanks that they've had there ever since the Cold War. And so Russia has more tanks in it than Moldova has people or something like that. I mean, ridiculously in the middle of this conflict.
Right. And didn't their prime minister, she resigned like last week, 2 weeks ago? Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're in Moldova, which is a discrete country, sort of, from Russia, and you're having a consultation with leaders from the church in Russia. So is this the Russian Orthodox Church? Who are you working with?
Yeah, these are evangelicals. This is one of the evangelical seminaries in southern Russia. And my colleague in this is a Ukrainian named Taras, and together we're leading this set of meetings. And the next, by this time a year ago, so we were 2 days out from the start of the war, 3 days out from the start of the war, a couple of the Ukrainians said, we can't come. Tensions are too high. We can't leave our seminary. 3 days later, Russia invaded. And that morning, that night, we went to bed with a lot of anxiety. That morning, Taras woke me up and said, it's begun, that the invasion had begun. And we were trying to get out of the country. I was moving my plane ticket. By the time I'd moved my plane ticket, the airport in Moldova, in Chisinau, the capital of Moldova, had closed. So all airspace is closed because the missiles that were being fired from the Black Sea area were going over Moldovan airspace into Ukraine. Ground troops were coming in from the east and the north near Kyiv. I was starting to figure out, how do I get a bus ticket to go to Romania so that I can maybe get to a functional airport, hoping they stay open, to get to Germany and make my way back home. And all of that sounds incredibly adventurous and difficult, and it wasn't fun. But all the while I'm doing that, my friend Taras is convincing a Moldovan to drive him to the Ukrainian border, where he's going to walk across, plead his case, and try to hitchhike back to his home city of Rivne, to be with his family, to be with the church, and ultimately to begin the work we would do over this last year, coordinating relief work and preparing the seminaries for what comes next. So it was an intense time, and it's actually very hard to believe that it was just a year ago. On the one hand, it feels like it was just 2 months ago, and on the other hand, the toll of this war is so great. I feel like my Ukrainian friends have all aged 5 years over the last 363 days or whatever it's been. So it's been intense.
So talk for a second about, because there has been, I'll make this case and let you address it. There has been an argument in some circles that the move by Putin, which is supported by a leader on the Russian Orthodox Church, is I'm not asking you to comment about the validity of that, but there is this connection that Putin claims, or that the Russian Orthodox Church, the leader there, is sort of agreeing to. What is the Russian Orthodox Church, and what is its relationship to the evangelical church in Russia?
Yeah. As you can imagine, it's complex, but to try to do it in at least simple terms and shortly is, within Russia, the evangelicals are a very small minority. They've had growth, and everybody can remember when the Soviet Union fell, there was a great influx of missionaries, money, movement. A lot of people came to faith and have been following Christ faithfully for the last 30 30 years. It's been exciting. However, that growth slowed. And the Orthodox Church has always been very connected to what was the Soviet government and the Russian government. And at this moment, there is a public blessing of the Orthodox Church on this war. It's couched as a war to promote Christian family values. It's a war to sort of eliminate the evil of the West that is encroaching nearer and nearer Russia through Ukraine. But what's interesting is Ukraine is the largest evangelical population in Eastern Europe. It's still a minority there. 70% plus of Ukrainians are of the Orthodox faith, and another probably 8 to 10% are Catholic. There's Ukrainian Orthodox and Russian Orthodox.
Let me just jump in here for a second.
Yeah.
To just note that there was the great schism that takes place in the church in the 11th century. Is it 1099?
So 1070, I think, but yeah, in that 11th century.
Yeah, in the 11th century, the church splits between the East, which is often referred to as the Orthodox Church, capital O, as opposed to Orthodox being an adjective to describe something that is, what's the synonym for Orthodox? I want to say Orthodox. Anyway, so you've got the
faithful, true.
Faithful, true, yes. So you've got the Orthodox, the capital O Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Ethiopian Orthodox churches. And then you have the Western Church, which is also called the Catholic Church, Catholic meaning universal. So there was a split between the Orthodox, between the East and the West, and ostensibly it's over icons. They're sort of fighting over whether or not icons are valid tools in worship, and then. But the real issue is the Bishop of Rome is claiming preeminence. So the Pope is claiming preeminence over all the other bishops in all the other areas. And the bishops in the East say, no, there is no preeminent bishop. We're sort of all in this together. So from that time, from the 11th century, there has been the Eastern Church and the Western Church. And then the Western Church, of course, will split with the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther and the 95 Theses and Wittenberg Door and all that stuff. So the Russian Orthodox Church has some kind of a marriage with Russia and Putin, and is claiming that this is an effort to keep the West and the corruption of the West out of Russia.
Yeah.
Okay,
that's correct. And our Ukrainian friends will point out that Ukraine has always had the largest degree of religious freedom in Eastern Europe. Part of its challenge even is under the Soviet Empire, Stalin was persecuting Ukrainians all throughout that time. It's a period of history where a couple million were starved to death. It's been a long and hard history, but part of it has had a religious component to it always, as well as power and politics. And so the Russian Orthodox Church has been heavily aligned with the war. Within Ukraine, many in the East belong to the Russian Orthodox Church. You can imagine that, prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian Orthodox Church was in various places across borders. But the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which has a bishop, a head leader who's Ukrainian, is aligned differently than the head leader in Russia. Cyril is his name, who's been blessing this war. So there's a divide between the Orthodox churches, and obviously the war splits them significantly. And then the evangelicals, who are maybe 4 or 5% of the population. So not a large group of people, but among that part of the world, one of the largest. And in fact, over the last 15 years, Ukraine has been known as the Bible Belt of Eastern Europe because of the evangelical presence and the work and thought that's being done there. So you can imagine how those Christians feel when they're told that this war is being fought to promote Christian family values, which are Putin's words frequently as the missiles hit apartment buildings and schools and hospitals, and they watch their nation being torn apart and destroyed, with some on that Russian side, claiming that it is in fact blessed by Christ, which is actually one of the phrases used not only by Putin, but by several of his ministers, that it is in fact a holy war for the sake of Christ. And meanwhile, the Christians on the other side feeling like something is very missing from the understanding of who Jesus is.
You're headed back to, are you headed back to Moldova? Where are you headed?
Heading back to Ukraine next week. So
okay.
A week from today, I'll be getting on a plane again.
And there's been a lot of money that has been passed through ScholarLeaders to get to the church, to get to the Ukrainian seminaries in order to disperse it to the churches, in order to reach to the people and care for them and provide for them. What I'm going to pivot from Ukraine in a second, but what's your sense of the mood of the Ukrainian church leaders at the moment?
At the moment, I would say there is a heavy current of weariness in the weight of this war, the toll that it's taken. Many of these seminary leaders have been heroic in their actions. As you mentioned, with our colleague organization, Overseas Council, we've mobilized over $2 million in relief and aid. We've had 10 seminaries that have been working in close coordination and collaboration to mobilize those funds. You had seminaries in Eastern Ukraine running evacuations. You had the seminary in Moldova at one point had almost 4,000 refugees living on their campus as people fled across the Ukrainian border into Moldova. Other seminaries hosting refugees for 2-3 days as they moved farther west, many of them into Western Europe. At one point, the vans for these seminaries were driving in with food and medical supplies, driving out with evacuees. Seminary in Kiev has been feeding almost 2,000 people a day for the last 8 months, every day, because even though the war itself has been held back from the borders of Kiev, and President Biden could be there in Kiev just yesterday, standing there with a certain level of safety, many people are impacted by the realities of economics and destruction and starving. So there's been this real good coordinated by the church, coordinated by these theological leaders who continue to be there. They describe it as a theology of presence. And on the one hand, they feel incredibly encouraged and blessed to be a part of it. But there's a weariness after a year of doing this, a year of watching just the evil and horror of war. Even when you get to see the bright heroics that are happening, that's a toll on the soul and the psyche.
So I remember I was on one of our at a theological consultation somewhere in Africa. I can't remember at the moment, but I was traveling in a van with Tim Dearborn, who was on our board at the time, and Tim was a World Vision, pretty high up the ranks of World Vision. I think providing theological reflection for all the general secretaries of World Vision in all these countries, and these were all bad places to be. And Tim was getting close to retirement, and in part he said the hassle of traveling was great because he was just had a hard time getting into countries because he looked like a CIA agent. You know, when you saw his passport, who's going to these countries that are in the midst of civil war and in the midst of all kinds of corruption and of all kinds of just, they're just bad places to be. Well, there's only a few different kinds of people who go. There's journalists, there's relief workers or missionaries, whether they're Christians or just more, NGO kinds of food and relief. And then there's the CIA. And so he said it was understood by, all these people that were policing the borders that there were, in fact, relief workers trying to get into their country, but he looked like he could either be a relief worker or he was a CIA agent. And I just remember sort of asking him about the weariness and asking him about what it's like to be there where you see so many people, starving, or you see the corruption or the war or just the lack of an infrastructure. So you've been spending the last 18 years traveling to a lot of these places, and you're supporting and coming alongside men and women who are committed. That's one of the things we should say. These folks get PhDs, and as part of that arrangement, they're going back to their home country or continent. We're committed. They have some sort of senior leadership position waiting for them upon their return. What gives you hope when you see the struggle and the pain in the Ukraine, but not just Ukraine? We could talk about Central African Republic. We could talk about Ethiopia. We could talk about Belarus. Talk about the Philippines. Talk about Myanmar. Talk about all these places. What gives you hope at times like this?
Yeah, and I mean, in the last year, I've been in Nigeria, Guatemala, Ukraine multiple times, Eastern Europe. I've been in Jordan, Middle East. I have a neighbor and friend who also believes I work for the CIA, but that's a different issue.
I tried telling my boys when they were young that I worked for the CIA because I thought they would think I was cool again, but it didn't happen. So
doesn't last long, right?
No.
But yeah, and I mean, there is this sense of you're seeing some of the hardest things that are happening around the world, but you are at the same time seeing God at work. And I think the idea of grace and redemption are themes that carry through. And we see it in the commitment level of some of these leaders. Certainly these Ukrainian leaders. In fact, one of the themes that we've been talking about is, why do people stay in the middle of this? What is it about their calling? What is it about their sense of what God has for them that requires them to stay? Or an Ethiopian friend of ours a few years ago who said, when I'm here in the West, people are always praying for persecution to end. He says, the church is purified through persecution. Don't pray for it to end. Pray for people to have the strength to face it. Yeah. And I thought, whew, boy, that's, but please don't pray that for me, right? Because I'd rather not. But what you see is that sense of depth of commitment, of calling, a sense of seeing God at work redemptively, of taking just the shattered reality of broken humanity and making beauty out of ashes, of making something work and whole, of seeing people care, of seeing human dignity restored, of seeing new life in Christ happening and growing and flourishing, and people who have every reason to lament all the time have a sense of joy about them. And when you're with a group of people, particularly believers who have this deep sense of trust in God, it buoys your own faith. It's incredibly sobering all the time. And it changes your perspective on what's important and some of the battles we fight and some of the outrage we have, or whatever the case may be, because it feels pretty small potatoes. And I've got my challenges, and I sort of get a gut check pretty frequently. And I tell people I love so many of the leaders we work with, and they are incredible friends, but boy, are some of them convicting. And as much as I love spending time with them, I feel punched in the gut a lot too, because of what I see of their faith. Yeah. And some of the realities, and the mirror reflects back on our own realities here within the West. I think that's one of the great joys of working in this space, is seeing that. And it changes how we view our own space, our own lives, which isn't just a sort of narcissistic gain we get, but it's a reality check of what the body of Christ is. Yeah. And how diverse and beautiful and big it is. And in seeing that, we also get a greatly enlarged sense of who God is. We can only know the greatness of God in our experience where we are. But when we engage other people and see through their eyes and their experiences, it enlarges our sense of who God is. And I've said for years, that increases my sense of worship of him. God is big enough for all the challenges we're facing in my little corner of the world. But boy, God's even bigger than that. Yeah. And you hear these stories and meet these people, and that's what I come away with that's encouraging.
Yeah. As I said, Sherry and I think this is one of the great joys we've had, is becoming friends with these folks. And yes, convicting. I remember being in Belarus, and I was supposed to preach this house church, which is just, it's a house, right? Which they've just sort of packed with people. And the leader says to me, we have reason to believe that there might be it wasn't KGB. I can't remember what they called them, but police there. And of course, Lukashenko has made Belarus a bad place to be. And he said, you might get in trouble. And I said, oh, what kind of trouble? He says, well, they may not like this and they may arrest you. And I've got visions of, wow, I know what a Turkish prison looks like from a TV program, whatever that was, Midnight Express or something. I'm like, what would happen? He goes, they would take you to the airport and you would have to leave the country. And I said, well, I'm on the first flight after the church, right? I mean, I'm preaching and I'm going to the airport. I go, I don't really understand what the risk is. And he said, well, you may not ever be able to get back into the country again. And I said, well, okay, that would make me sad, but it's not like I've been here very often. And I said, I don't really see the risk. I said, am I the problem? Like, is this a problem for you that I'm going to preach? I mean, do I bring, he goes, oh no. He goes, if you preach, then I don't. If you don't preach, then I have to preach. And he goes, if I get arrested, I get beaten up and put in prison. And I go, oh, so you're letting me know that if I preach, I get a ride to the airport, but that might be inconvenient. If you preach, you're going to get beaten again because he's already been beaten. You've already been in prison. I said, you know what? I'll go ahead and take this one for the team. I'll go ahead and preach. And I think he said something like, you are an American. There's different standards. You guys are a little bit softer. I don't think he said that, but that was clearly the implication. Like my ability to weather persecution was going to be several labor grades below his. Well, so talk for a second, and I've got an eye on the clock here, but talk for a second about the growth of the church outside of the West, because those of us who are living in the US and maybe not traveling outside of the West and are not aware of the growth in Africa, in Asia, in China, in Iran, in other places. The center of the church, the center of gravity definitely shifted. It went south and east, and you can confirm that, can you?
Yeah. For a number of years, we've been watching this just exponential growth of the church in majority world, the global South, the South and East from where we sit, and to the point where absolutely there are certainly more evangelicals in Africa than there are in North America. The growth rates of some of these countries are incredibly high, and we're seeing so many people come to faith in Christ, and it's very exciting. And in some places that creates this leadership gap that ScholarLeaders and some others are trying to address, right? How do we train pastors for this ever-growing church? And some of those places are really hard places on top of it, and yet the church continues to grow. You mentioned Iran, like the church has continued to grow in Iran. I was 10, 12, 13 years ago, I was with an Iranian pastor, and we were talking about where he lived in Tehran. He said, the great thing about Tehran is it's a big city, which means you can move around a lot and not get arrested. And I thought, well, that's a different approach to how you view where you live. Subsequently, he was arrested and spent 6 years in prison. And a lot of it had to do with preaching the gospel. But he told stories of, the hottest selling book in the black market was the Bible. And there's a whole ethical dilemma to work through on that. But the idea that people are being willing to suffer for the sake of the gospel, and we're seeing its fruit. In Ethiopia, one of the denominations under communism was several hundred people. By the time communism fell in Ethiopia, it was 100 times bigger. It was thousands of members. And so you see, even in the hard places, the church grows. And I think for us in the West, one, there's just a reminder that the faith is being shaped and developed outside of Western Christianity. And for many of us in the US, that's a very suburban Christianity, and our churches look very similar wherever we are. And while there is a great similarity with our sisters and brothers globally, there's a lot of difference too. And that's exciting. It's one of the reasons we continue to promote what we say, amplify those voices of what's happening, what they're learning, how that can help shape us and how we can grow in Christ consequently. But yeah, we're seeing it. I mean, it's estimated that Nigeria may be the most populous Christian nation in the next 20 years as its population continues to accelerate. And as we know here in the West, our population rates are not very high. But at the same time, it's good news. At the same time, it's challenging news, because where's the impact of the church? And we want to see that happen, not just numbers, but depth and fruit and a transformation that's happening around because of the Christians who are there, salt and light, having impact.
So I'm gonna pivot. I've got one question, then I'm gonna take you into the lightning round here. So
right.
The last sort of scholar leader question that I want to ask is, at the last board meeting, so 2 weeks ago, whatever, Sunday, a gang was named Scholar Leader of the Year. And so I'm not sure if he's the 5th or 6th. I know that, Antonio was that, Gladys has been that, Salim has been that. Tell a story about a scholar that, when you get a chance, when somebody says, what is it that you do and why do you do it?
Yeah.
Tell a story, one of the stories of one of the Scholar Leaders of the Year. Maybe Sunday, I don't know. I mean, I'm fans of all.
Yeah. I mean, Sunday's one of those. I mean, Sunday, we supported Sunday for his PhD at Fuller. He returned to Nigeria. He's led 2 different seminaries there. He had a ministry that he started for widows and orphans. He tells an incredible story of he lives in the city of Jos, which is in the middle of Nigeria, where the Muslim majority north and the Christian majority south meet. And that's led to conflict over the years. It's one of those places where the seminary, a different previous leader, Bulus Galadima, once called in the army to park a tank in front of the seminary to keep the mob back, which I'm pretty sure Trinity.
I don't think they've done that yet. I don't think
requested.
any of the deans at Trinity have done that yet.
Yeah, but Sunday, at the same time, he's been working on issues of Christian ethics and public theology, and what does that look like in Africa, and particularly what does forgiveness look like when we talk about turning the other cheek in an area where there's persecution, and what does that look like, and what does it mean? Does that mean just rolling over and being stepped on and killed? Does it mean standing up for your rights? As you described the seminary, does it mean I'm not going to let you invade and hurt people? I'm not going to attack you. I'm not going to try to seek power, but I am going to use my strength to stop you from doing evil. Yep. So Sunday's an incredible leader at multiple levels, all the way at the grassroots of these poor widows and orphans who are being cared for, all the way up to these very complex theological thought. Or Valentin Sanini, who's one of the Ukrainian leaders we're working with, who we supported him for his PhD that he's completed just right before the war started. His seminary in Kherson, which is in an area of Ukraine that was occupied by the Russian army. It's since been liberated. Their entire campus has been destroyed. Early in the war, after the Russians took it over, they made it a barracks for one of their brigades. And then obviously in the liberation, it was caught in the crossfire. There's not a single building left. Kherson went from a city of 500,000 to currently 10,000 residents. He's trying to figure out, how do we not only continue to do this relief work, how do we rebuild our seminary and continue to train pastors? And where do we go? Do we go back? There's only 10,000 people there. Is that the right place to rebuild? Big questions and strategic questions. And he has this immense commitment to his country and to the people and to the church. And in every question asking, how is Jesus reflected in what we do? And that's convicting in the middle of a war where, quite frankly, that isn't always my first question. Some of the women we're supporting are amazing too. It's just incredible to see, and some of these leaders, and every once in a while you get to be right with them and have meals and have these conversations.
Those are life-changing. I am going to be in Ghana this summer. We've got a consultation. So there's a consultation. ScholarLeaders is hosting. You're part of that. And I'm going to be in Ghana when it's talking about Islam. And then I'm staying in order to, we've helped plant 2 churches in Ghana. So I'm going to go to see those churches, which I was going to do when COVID hit. And so I'm long overdue. I'm not going to get to go to Kenya because I need to take advantage of being in Ghana to go to these churches. But I know Gladys Mawidi, who just lost her husband, Gershon, was tragically killed. But Gladys is one of the most powerful, thoughtful, strategic leaders that I've had a chance to know. And I was so looking forward to seeing Gladys. But okay, so the three final questions here. What are you reading at the moment?
Somehow I've got multiple things going on at the same time. The beauty of getting airline travel with long flights is you start multiple books. Currently, I've been just wrapping up Miroslav Volf's End of Memory, what does it mean in the midst of being attacked and persecuted to forgive those who persecute you? And what does it mean to remember rightly? We often say forgive and forget, but that's not always, it doesn't really work. But what does it mean to remember rightly so that the wrongs that have been done and the evil that's been done can be a part of forgiveness and reconciliation?
Okay. So let me just say to those who don't know Miroslav Volf, he's a professor at Fuller for a while. He's now at Yale. Yeah. Correct? He's still at Yale?
Yeah, I believe so.
And he was born in Croatia. I mean, I'm going to put him in
former Yugoslavia. Yeah,
former Yugoslavia, and he was doing some work. Last I looked, I've got a couple of his books. He was doing some work with Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, and they were talking about religion and reconciliation. So Miroslav Volf, one of the premier theologians today. Okay, so second question: what book or podcast or movie or something, what have you been recommending more than anything else in the last year? So when you get a chance to say to somebody, oh, you've got to watch this, or you've got to listen to this, or you got to read this article, or you got to get this book, what have you found yourself, what's been one of the go-to recommendations you've been making?
Yeah. Well, on podcast last year, I got pulled into the rise and fall of Mars Hill, which I thought was going to be like a 4-hour commitment, and they kept going for quite a long time.
Yeah. But, I don't want that to be your recommendation. But,
it was interesting to see how that went. But I think, well, I mean, it depends on who I'm talking to. I think for a lot of my Christian friends, I've been recommending, you mentioned Yohanna Catanaccio, I've been recommending his book, Reading John Through Palestinian Eyes, as a way to encounter a very familiar set of biblical texts, the Gospel of John, but looking at it from a different perspective and how he weaves in both historical and contemporary realities of the Middle East and kind of shakes up sometimes how we read our own context into the text. And so that's been one of the pieces I've recommended as a way to gain other perspective.
Interesting. So I've got Yohanna's book on praying the Psalms.
Psalms, yeah, also.
And
good.
So just to sort of put this level set the room. So Yohanna and his wife Dina Catanaccio were at Christ Church for probably 3 or 4 years while he was doing his PhD in Old Testament at Trinity, and then he returned. Initially, I think he returned to Bethlehem Bible College where he was academic dean, but then he's moved. There's some sister relationship. You would know this more than I would, but with Nazareth Bible College.
Yeah, Nazareth Evangelical College.
Yeah, and I have Yohanna was the first guy, I don't know, 15 years ago to try to take me around Nazareth in the Middle East, and it was so fascinating because I mean he'd grown up there. He grew up right next. Have you been to his apartment? Yeah. So I mean, right out the back door is the Church of the Ascent, or no, the Church of the Immaculate Conception. No, the Church of the. It's the Church of the Annunciation. I was going to say the Ascension. The Church of the Annunciation. So where it's believed that the angel Gabriel appeared to Mary and said, "Behold, you have found favor with God. You're going to give birth to a son. He will be Christ the Lord." And so it's, I remember, yeah, it's just right there. I'm going to take you to that church. We're going to walk over there. I'm like, okay, this is a little hard for me to comprehend. And Dina is the director of the Bible Society
Bible Society.
for who? Is it for Israel,
for
Palestine?
Israel, Palestine, and I think now even more broadly regional. I think her role has increased, but yeah,
Okay.
for essentially the Holy Land and surrounding areas.
Yeah, I was
a couple.
one of the more profound moments that I had when I was in Bethlehem Bible College. I don't remember, but they were talking. So Johanna has now received Israeli citizenship. So he's a Palestinian, and Palestinians, many do not have they have no passport because they have no country. And Dina and their children, she was an Israeli citizen, so she's a Palestinian Israeli. So she had citizenship. And so when they would travel back and forth between Chicago, when they were at Trinity, and their home in Bethlehem, she and the kids could fly into Tel Aviv, right? But he couldn't. He had to fly into Jordan on his Jordanian papers. So he doesn't have a passport, he has papers. And then they would go, then he would try and go from Jordan to get into Israel, and he would often be stopped, and it could be days that he would be held up. And he was talking along with a couple of the other younger faculty there, Palestinian Christian faculty at Bethlehem Bible College, and they were talking about being held in this sort of dark, pitch black cell for several days. And they were not being let into Israel. And then when Johanna got into Israel, then he got stopped at a checkpoint, and the young soldier, I mean, this is all complicated. I'm not trying to suggest otherwise, but the soldier, the Israeli soldier, said, "You have to strip." And Johanna said, "Okay, look, you're trying to embarrass me. And the fact of the matter is I really want to get home, and you have all the power and I don't. So I will strip, but you have to understand what you're doing is bad for you. And I don't hate you. I serve Jesus. He tells me I'm to love everyone, including my enemies. You want me to hate you? I don't hate you. I will not hate you. I love you. And because I love you, I'm going to tell you what you're doing. It's embarrassing to me, but it's bad for your soul. You don't want to do this." And then he spoke to these young faculty members, and he said, "Look, you cannot hate. You have to love, and you have to model love, and you have to care for these people that are treating you poorly." It was a profound moment. Johanna is such a thoughtful, profound leader. So appreciate him.
Absolutely.
Okay, one last question. What are you working on now? And I guess I'm expecting or hoping you're going to say something about the Insights Journal.
So well, for the Insights Journal, which is a journal that we started to publish 6 years ago now, we being ScholarLeaders, and I serve as the senior editor for the journal, and it's to bring together majority world voices, majority world concerns in theological education, promote those and circulate them so that various places can learn from one another, including the West, but really championing those voices, trying to lift them up. And we have a couple of pieces coming out. Our next issue is due in the spring. And one of those is on the idea of what does formation look like, particularly post-COVID, where everybody went online. And the idea of seminaries often is that you're formed, obviously, intellectually through your classes, but you're formed holistically and spiritually. You're often living in this community with other believers. When you go online, how does that happen? And so we've got several different seminaries weighing in on what that looks like and how they bring it together and what they're learning or trying to do, because everybody went online during COVID and it's not going away. And how does that affect? Teaching's one thing, but formation is a separate piece. And that's something that we hold very dearly. We'll also have a very profound piece out of one of the leaders from Ukraine in that one that I think is one of the most succinct, descriptions of what's going on right now, and he asked how the leaders are feeling. But he talks about community and how communities are being reshaped, and what it means to form a community around, not around geography and not necessarily around activity, but around a sense of common belief and commitment. And it's a pretty profound piece of how that's evolved among these seminary leaders in the midst of this war. And glad that one's going to be in there with the series of things on formation.
Yeah, that sounds great.
So that'll be in June.
How do people, so I should mention this. So if somebody wants to learn more about Scholar Leaders, they go to the website, and that's just scholarleader.org.
Yep, scholarleaders.org. Singular scholar, plural leaders, scholarleaders.org.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't had to type that in all the way in a long time.
Auto-populates.
And then if they want the Insights Journal, can they read these articles? Do they have to subscribe to this?
So,
how would they get that?
All the articles are published on our website, insightsjournal.org. You can subscribe. Subscription is free, and you'll receive notices when new issues come, or periodically we'll put out articles prior to the issue, just to keep people reading and something that's maybe poignant or timely. But all of them are accessible, a series of authors, topics that you can read there. Insightsjournal.org is the website for that.
Okay. Well, Evan, it's been an hour. Thank you for your time, and Godspeed when you head to Ukraine. And we'll look forward to hearing more from you. Appreciate Scholar Leaders. So onward and upward.
Thanks, Mike. It's a great privilege. Great to talk.
Talk to you later. Bye-bye.